Thanksgiving in Phoenix was always a performance. The table set like a stage and everyone costumed as their best selves. That night, Aunt Patricia lifted her wine glass with the confidence of a ringmaster and announced that company inheritance must go to blood relatives only, not outsiders. Her voice cut through the chatter, and the room obeyed, falling into the kind of silence that remembers slights. Cousins nodded, Uncle Robert folded his arms like a verdict, and even my adoptive parents stared at their plates. I smiled, as if the words were weather I had already learned to walk through. My name is Martha Collins, and for 25 years I have eaten pie in this family while being reminded I was invited to the table, not born to it. Patricia basked in the quiet she had made and added that Smith Enterprises had been built by real family members and would stay that way. She let her gaze rest on me with the soft cruelty of someone who thinks truth is only what she can say aloud. Jessica, the marketing director, chimed in about keeping the business in the family. I nodded and agreed that loyalty is everything, which it is, though not in the way they meant. What they didn't know sat inside me like a sealed envelope. The evening closed with Patricia promising that when succession was discussed, the right people would be rewarded. I drove back to Scottsdale under a clear desert sky and felt more relief than ache. Those words no longer had the power to bruise. They were simply the sound that told me my timing was right. 5 years earlier. The only person who had ever made me feel like more than a hyphenated relation, my maternal grandmother. Helen Morrison died and left me her entire estate, $75 million gathered over a lifetime of modest living and luminous instinct. In her letter, she wrote that I had a good mind for business and should use it wisely. I was 23 and understood the difference between comfort and purpose. At the same time, Smith Enterprises, my adoptive family's manufacturing company, was drowning in rising costs and shrinking orders. They whispered about investors while smiling for holiday cards. I hired a financial advisor, Douglas Whitman, and asked for a structure that hid my name completely. He built a latticework of holding companies and trusts with the precision of a watchmaker. Through those entities, I invested all $75 million into Smith Enterprises anonymously. Money has its own grammar. It spoke by keeping factories open and paychecks steady through winters that would have broken the company. It spoke by buying new machines, retraining teams, and pushing the product line out of the past. Revenues stabilized, then grew, inside the family. The story we told at dinners was that grit had saved us. I let that story breathe, quietly. Share by share, the investment accumulated into control. After 5 years, the numbers resolved into a sentence with my name in it, majority owner. 51%. I sat at holiday tables and listened to speeches about bloodlines while being the one person whose vote could change the air in any boardroom. I did not need to perform power. I only needed to hold it. By the time Patricia performed her toast this Thanksgiving, the seed had fully rooted. The insult didn't sting. It clarified. The next morning, in my home office with the Sonoran light pooling on my desk, I opened the latest reports. They were a gorgeous story of margins improved, debt retired, and expansion successfully executed. Then I called Douglas. We exchanged pleasantries, and when he asked how my holiday had been, I said, enlightening. He waited. I told him I wanted to withdraw the entire investment principal and accumulated returns and redeploy the proceeds elsewhere. He paused long enough to let the implications gather, then asked if I was certain. He explained that the company had become dependent on that capital, that the legal structures would make the extraction careful work, that 30 to 60 days might be required. Yes, I said, I am certain. He asked where I wanted the funds to go. I told him I had studied a Denver firm, West Park Industries, a competitor with a record of inclusive leadership and merit-based promotion. If money is a vote, I wanted mine counted where values and competence aligned. The mechanics began that afternoon. Douglas prepared the withdrawal notice. I asked him to make sure it arrived under the letterhead that mattered, and that the language made my ownership position unmistakable. He agreed. Professional voice even, a hint of satisfaction easing through. When the email confirmation arrived, I felt the quiet click of a long plan reaching its next notch. It wasn't vengeance, it was alignment. In families like mine, love is often conditional. In companies like mine, respect had been made conditional too. I would not fund conditions that erased me. Over the weekend, the family's phones burned. I know because the bylaws guaranteed me notices of all board activity, and because fear never stays in one room. There would be an emergency board meeting on Tuesday at 9:00 a.m. I was entitled to attend any meeting by right of my shares. I rarely exercised it. This time, I would sit at the table I already owned. I chose a navy suit, printed the ownership documents, and slept well. Tuesday morning, I arrived 30 minutes early at headquarters, the desert sun white on the glass. Kelly at reception looked startled to see me. I told her I was there for the meeting. Behind me, the lobby doors burst open, spilling Patricia and the cousins into the light, each of them carrying a weekend of panic in their faces. They demanded to know if anyone had reached the foreign investor. I said nothing at first. I have learned that the distance between confidence and collapse is sometimes only the length of a paused breath. Then I told them the investor had arrived. Their eyes moved over me, searching for a punchline. I opened my portfolio. Paper has weight. So does truth. And on both. My name appeared where they had never thought to look. Patricia's hands trembled as she read the document I placed in front of her. The seal of Morrison Holdings gleamed on the page, and beneath it, the ownership line that tied everything back to me. Jessica leaned over her mother's shoulder, her lips moving silently as if rereading would rearrange the truth. Robert's face flushed crimson, his jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. Brandon stared as though the floor had shifted under him. I let them sit in the silence, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space where their old certainty used to live. Finally, Patricia whispered the words she couldn't accept. Morrison Holdings is a subsidiary of the Collins Family Trust, which is controlled by Martha Collins. She lifted her head, her eyes wide, her voice breaking as she asked how this could be possible. I answered plainly. 5 years of capital, $75 million turned into lifeblood for the company they bragged about at every dinner, had come from me. Robert's rage boiled over. He called it a lie, said I couldn't have that kind of money. I explained that Helen Morrison, my grandmother, had left me her entire fortune. He sneered, demanding how she could leave everything to an outsider when the Smiths were family. I reminded him of what Patricia had declared only days earlier at Thanksgiving. That inheritance belonged to blood relatives only. I asked him softly, "Are we family?" The question landed heavier than shouting ever could. Patricia slammed her hand on the table, calling it blackmail, saying I was letting my feelings destroy 3 generations of legacy. I corrected her. I wasn't destroying anything. I was withdrawing my investment because they made it clear I was not welcome. The company's attorney, David Sherman, shuffled through the documents, his frown deepening with each page. At last, he confirmed what I had already told them, that I legally owned 51% of Smith Enterprises. Their faces told the story of people who had lived decades assuming entitlement, only to discover they were tenants in a house they didn't own. Jessica demanded to know why I hadn't revealed myself earlier, why I had chosen to live modestly if I controlled their empire. I told her that modest living had allowed me to see their true characters, that people reveal themselves best when they think you have nothing they need. Brandon's voice broke with desperation when he realized what was coming. He begged me to reconsider, pointing out that if I withdrew, the company would collapse, and they would all lose everything. I listened, not without sympathy, but reminded him of their own words. This company belonged to blood relatives only. They would have to find a way to carry on without the money of an outsider. Their faces drained of color, as if they were watching the ground split beneath their feet and realizing there was no bridge to the other side. The following days were filled with chaos that barely touched me. Patricia and Robert placed frantic calls to business contacts, searching for replacement investors. Jessica and Brandon reached out to banks, only to find credit was no longer eager to flow to a company whose leadership had ignored its true ownership structure. News spread quickly in Phoenix's business circles, and soon whispers grew into headlines. The Smith family had been dismissive toward their majority shareholder, and were now facing ruin because of it. Douglas called me more than once, his voice tinged with awe. "You've given them 5 years of stability, Martha. Now everyone in the community sees what kind of people they really are." By Thursday, the documents finalizing my withdrawal were signed in Douglas's office. I transferred my stake into West Park Industries, the Denver competitor whose practices matched the values my grandmother had trusted me to carry. I walked out lighter. Even as the Smith family's empire teetered on collapse, Patricia sent me texts that alternated between begging and blaming. "We can work this out. Family means everything," followed by, "You've destroyed what generations built." I stopped replying. They still didn't understand that I hadn't destroyed their company. They had destroyed their own future the moment they decided my belonging was conditional. Days later, The board convened again, though this time the room felt like a courtroom. They sat across from me, hollow-eyed from sleepless nights, waiting for a reprieve I wasn't offering. Their voices were thin, brittle, asking if there was any way to negotiate, to restructure. I told them no. My funds were already committed elsewhere. Patricia's eyes burned with tears and fury as she accused me of wrecking them out of spite. I looked at her and said the truth. I had simply chosen to invest in people who valued my partnership. Weeks passed, and the inevitable arrived. Smith Enterprises filed for bankruptcy. The Phoenix Business Journal splashed the story across its front page. Family manufacturing dynasty collapses after alienating majority shareholder. Analysts called it one of the most preventable corporate disasters in decades. They said due diligence would have revealed the ownership structure, but the family had been too distracted by their own politics to see the truth. Employees worried at first, but West Park Industries quickly absorbed most of the skilled staff, offering them better prospects than the Smiths ever had. That part brought me relief, knowing the innocent would not pay for the arrogance of my adoptive family. One evening, Jessica called in tears. Patricia had suffered a heart attack from the stress of losing the company. She begged me to reconsider, to forgive, to save them. My chest tightened with sympathy. But I told her plainly that forgiveness and business were not the same. I wished Patricia a recovery, but my decision stood. I would not rebuild for people who had spent decades insisting I was less than family. Months later, I sat at a boardroom table in Denver, presenting to colleagues who valued skill over surname. They listened, took notes, and praised my contributions. James Morrison, West Park's CEO, shook my hand and invited me to join their board of directors. For the first time, I felt like I was sitting in a room where my worth was measured not by bloodlines, but by ideas. On the drive home to my modest but comfortable house, I reflected on the strange symmetry the Smiths had tried to exclude me, and in doing so, they had made me wealthier and freer than I had ever imagined. The bankruptcy consumed everything the Smiths had clung to as proof of their superiority. The family estate, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, all seized to pay creditors. Robert, once so proud of his executive title, now faced the humiliation of applying for work with no offers in sight. Jessica, who had lectured me about family loyalty in business, discovered that no marketing firm in Phoenix wanted her name attached to theirs after the scandal. Brandon, stripped of his cushy position, took shifts at a warehouse for minimum wage. Their fall was not just financial, it was social. Once admired pillars of a business dynasty, they became whispers at dinner parties, cautionary tales about pride and blindness. For me, the days that followed were quiet, deliberate, and strangely liberating. I declined interview requests from magazines and television hosts who wanted the story of the adopted daughter who secretly owned her family's company. I didn't need to play to their appetite for scandal. My satisfaction came from smaller moments, the hum of my Denver neighborhood in the evenings, the steady rhythm of board meetings where my contributions were respected, the realization that my grandmother's trust in me had not been misplaced. Patricia, however, could not leave me alone. She sent messages that swung wildly between apology and accusation. One morning, my phone buzzed with a line that read, "I hope you're happy now that you've destroyed everything our family built." I deleted it without responding. They still didn't understand. I had not destroyed anything. I had simply stopped being their safety net, their hidden foundation. For 5 years, I gave them stability and success. They could have chosen gratitude, inclusion, even simple respect. Instead, they chose arrogance and exclusion. And when I stepped away, their illusion collapsed under its own weight. 6 months later, I stood in West Park's Denver headquarters, delivering my first quarterly report as a new board member. James Morrison sat across the table, listening closely as I explained market shifts and operational adjustments that could increase efficiency. When I finished, he leaned back with a thoughtful smile and said my insights had already improved production by 23%. That acknowledgement meant more to me than every empty toast I had endured in Phoenix. It was proof that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one that recognizes your worth. After the meeting, I drove home through streets lined with winter trees, their bare branches sharp against the Colorado sky. My house was modest, not a mansion. but warm with the kind of peace I had never felt in the Smith household. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, thinking about how far I had come. 5 years earlier, I had been a grieving granddaughter, uncertain what to do with an unexpected fortune. Now I was a businesswoman with a seat at the table of a thriving company, valued not for my last name, but for my contributions. That night, my phone rang again. This time it was Jessica. Her voice was thin, heavy with exhaustion. She told me her mother was still unwell, the heart attack having left Patricia weaker than before. She pleaded with me, saying their family had lost everything and needed my forgiveness. I felt a wave of compassion. She was, after all, someone I had grown up alongside, but I also understood the difference between forgiveness and erasure. Forgiveness did not mean I had to sacrifice myself again. Not when I had already spent years doing so. I told her I hoped her mother recovered, but my decisions would not change. The line went quiet, except for her muffled sobs. And when she hung up, I set the phone down and let the silence settle. The Phoenix Business Journal published follow-up articles, dissecting the Smith family's downfall in excruciating detail. Analysts framed it as a corporate cautionary tale. Proof that ignoring governance and treating shareholders as invisible could end in ruin. One headline read, "Family pride ends in corporate collapse." Another quoted an expert who said, "In 30 years, I've never seen a more preventable disaster." All they needed to do was look at their ownership structure. Each article reinforced what I already knew: they had undone themselves. Meanwhile, my world grew steadily brighter. I met colleagues at West Park who valued merit above lineage, who saw me not as an adopted afterthought, but as a partner with vision. I invested time and friendships with people who cared about character more than wealth. My grandmother's words in her letter returned to me often. "Use this wisely. You have a brilliant mind for business." I smiled, knowing I had done exactly that. In the quiet of my living room, I sometimes thought of Patricia's last desperate message and realized how different our definitions of family truly were. To her, family meant bloodlines and legacy, even when it bred cruelty. To me, family meant trust, respect, and shared purpose. That was the real inheritance my grandmother had given me, and it was worth more than money. The following spring, I attended a charity gala in Denver as a guest of West Park Industries. The ballroom sparkled with glass and light, filled with conversations about innovation and community impact. As I mingled, I felt the quiet confidence of someone finally standing on ground she had earned. No one asked about my last name. No one questioned whether I belonged. They listened to my ideas, nodded thoughtfully, and treated me as an equal. That was all I had ever wanted. A week later, Douglas called with the final report on Smith Enterprises' liquidation. Assets had been sold off, debts settled, and what remained of the family's fortune had vanished. Patricia and Robert had lost their home. Jessica's savings had been wiped out, and Brandon was still struggling to find steady work. "Their reputation is scorched earth," Douglas told me. "No investor in Phoenix will touch them. They're finished." I thanked him for his diligence, though I felt no joy in the news. Vindication, yes, but no joy. It was one thing to hold people accountable, another to take pleasure in their ruin. What comforted me was knowing the employees were safe. West Park had absorbed most of them, and reports showed that morale was higher than ever. Skilled workers who once worried about layoffs now spoke proudly about their future. That knowledge steadied me when old guilt tried to creep in. I had not destroyed livelihoods. I had preserved them, redirecting stability away from arrogance and toward respect. On a quiet evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the Colorado air crisp against my skin. I thought about my grandmother. She had seen something in me I hadn't yet seen in myself, a resilience forged from years of being told I didn't belong. Her estate had been more than money. It was belief in my ability to shape my own destiny. I whispered into the twilight, "I hope I've honored you." And in the silence that followed, I felt as though she had answered. Months passed, and occasionally I still received messages from Patricia. They shifted from anger to apology, sometimes within the same day. One said, "You'll regret walking away from us." Another, hours later, "Read. Please. Martha, we need you. Family means everything." I stopped reading them after a while. She was clinging to a definition of family that had never included me. To respond would have been to pretend otherwise. One summer afternoon, I visited the Denver plant that Westpark had expanded with my investment. Workers shook my hand, thanked me for believing in their future. Some spoke of how the changes had allowed them to buy homes or send their kids to college. Their gratitude humbled me. For the first time, I saw clearly the ripple effect of choices made not out of pride, but out of purpose. It was a reminder that money is not just a measure of power. It is a tool that can either cage or free, depending on how it is used. At night, I sometimes revisited memories of those long Phoenix dinners, where I sat smiling politely while listening to reminders of my supposed place. I realize now that my place had never been defined by their acceptance. It had been waiting for me all along, shaped by my own choices, ready the moment I stopped seeking their approval. That knowledge was the true inheritance, greater even than $75 million. The final chapter of the Smith family became a footnote in business history, a case study professors used in classrooms, a story analysts repeated on panels about governance. My name came up occasionally in those discussions, but I preferred to remain in the background. Let the lesson be theirs: arrogance and exclusion can topple empires faster than competition ever could. As for me, I moved forward. My life was no longer about proving I belonged at anyone's table. It was about building my own, surrounded by colleagues who valued me, friends who loved me, and a future I had chosen for myself. I finally understood what family truly meant. It is not blood that binds us, but respect, trust, and kindness. That is what endures. And so, when I think back to Patricia's toast at Thanksgiving, the words that once stung now sound almost poetic in their irony. She had declared that inheritance belonged only to blood relatives. But in the end, her words carved her family's downfall while guiding me to my greatest truth. Family is not defined by who shares your name, but by who shares your respect. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden lessons behind family, power, and resilience. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about what family means to you.